So welcome everyone. Tonight is just another conversation series with the Centre for Engineering Education, so welcome. Tonight's talk is entitled, Are the Disciplines Dead? My name's Emanuela Tilly, I'm the chair for tonight, and hopefully I'll do my best to make sure that we keep these four guest speakers on time, but also try to engage a little bit of a conversation. I'm sure the four of them, from their perspectives on this, will lead us into great areas of thinking. So just to set this up a little bit, the talk is really about addressing some key questions. So the key questions for tonight are, we know that engineering in particular, and what's happening around us, the complex problems that engineers are involved in currently, but also our future engineers, the students we are teaching now, we know that they will be working on problems that don't necessarily respect the boundaries of disciplines. So that's our premise tonight. And the key questions that we are going to be tackling with the conversation tonight is, why do traditional engineering disciplines still remain common operational units? So why do those still exist and are very much the norm? And because we know industry are looking for graduates with skills that are, of a much broader set, and we expect them to work across the different areas, do we think that the way we are teaching them in the current structures that we have will provide the education required for the graduates to succeed, not just in industry, but to make an impact in the later part of the 21st century, as it's put in the description tonight. So, I've got four speakers here. I'm just going to really briefly introduce you to them. This is Carl Gombrich. He's the current director of the Arts and Science program here, the BASc program at UCL. He has degrees in maths, physics, and philosophy, was once a professional opera singer, and joined UCL in 2002. His research, and he writes about related things on contemporary liberal and interdisciplinary education, and does quite a lot of work on and research on the areas of notions of expertise in the history of education. We've got Sarah Spurgeon here. She's a professor of control engineering, head of the Department of Electronic and Electrical Engineering here at UCL. She works on a range of systems in her research, electric vehicles, as well as the human immune system. Sarah is also president of the Engineering Professors Council. Michael Young is internationally known as a leading sociologist and educational thinker. Just say, I almost redefined your work. And is an emeritus professor of education at the UCL Institute of Education. And his main research interests are sociology of knowledge and its application to curriculum, with particular reference to post-compulsory phase of education and training. And then we have Alpai, the Director of Learning and Teaching and Program Leader for the undergraduate programs in the Department of Chemical and Process Engineering at the University of Surrey. Some of his current interests are developing and evaluating student transferable skills, peer-based learning, and formative assessment practices. He is also very involved in the use of gamification and virtual immersion reality in engineering education. So, I turn the floor over to our first speaker, Carl.
Thank you, Manuela. So, as Manuela says, my name is Carl Gombrich. I run the Arts and Sciences BASc, Bachelor of Arts and Sciences at UCL. We were the first in the country to introduce this particular coding on UCAS, and we've been very successful, which is very nice for my feelings of achievement. Not great for the email threads and so on, but we've now got about 120 to 130 students per year, and the graduate outcomes are fantastic, and I'll tell you a bit more about that in a moment. My short answer to the question, are the disciplines dead, is no, but they are under pressure, I think, for very good reason, and I think we need to think about why those pressures exist and how we recast big parts of education in the light of those pressures. One of the reasons I think the Arts and Sciences degree has been successful is that the vast majority of white-collar, i.e. graduate jobs, are now no longer disciplinary based. We've seen now in the hundreds and soon to be thousands of the sorts of things our students go on to do, whether it's working for an NGO or a tech startup or government organisation, a consultancy or a bank. Employers are simply not interested in what discipline you studied. You are just as likely, in fact probably more likely I would say now, though we need some evidence on this, to get the interest of a major employer if you don't just have a degree in discipline X. Because as was said to me by Alan Wilson, the very great interdisciplinary scholar, founder of the field of mathematical geography, the real world has problems and universities have departments. And this is well known to almost all employers. So apart from a very few specialist areas such as dentistry and perhaps one or two in engineering, by the way, my talk's going to have to be by necessity broader than just engineering because that's my expertise, and I'll try to reference engineering when I can. But bar a few very specialist areas, and including perhaps some, but certainly not all engineering disciplines, employers are simply not interested in the single discipline you've done. So our students go on to an enormous range of jobs, very successfully so, and interestingly an enormous range of masters and PhDs as well. So people studying criminology at Cambridge, paleobiology at Bristol, real estate management at Cambridge, brain sciences here, finances, a PhD in computational cognitive neuroscience at Edinburgh, another PhD here in energy consumption, human behavior, etc., etc., etc. You probably all know this in this room. This is the world we live in. It really, really is. And yet we haven't quite caught up with that in education at the moment. In fact, very much we haven't quite caught up. We really haven't caught up at all, I would say. However, I do think that the disciplines have had a purpose, and recently there was a book called A Defense of the Disciplines by an American health expert, actually, Jerry Jacobs, which gave a very good critique of kind of too much loose talk about the end of the disciplines. One thing he said is that actually so he did a lot of very good bibliographic research. He looked at thousands of papers and whether they cited other disciplines within their own research. And disciplines are actually pretty good at citing people from other disciplines. So engineers do actually cite economists, sociologists do cite psychologists, etc., etc. And if we think, as I do, that universities have done a pretty good job of research over the last 100, 200 years, we need to recognize that the disciplines have been part of that. They've given structure, they've given order, they've required rigor, and if you then add to that Jacob's idea that actually we've been pretty open-minded in many ways, we've been quite eclectic about sourcing and referencing people from other disciplines, there's no reason, he would say, to be sort of smash up all the houses kind of argument, we're stuck in some kind of rut. I think also from the learning perspective, from a student's perspective, disciplines give you order. They give you structure, so they reduce the noise you have to cope with when wondering what you're really studying. We take for granted that we kind of know what, say, psychology is, or even biology is, or even know what engineering is. Of course we don't. We've got really no idea what any of these things are. We're constantly talking about, is engineering just problem solving? Is it the great new liberal education? Is biology the study of life? What is life? And so on and so on. But these are very big questions, which when you're learning you don't want to be dealing with all day. So your very handy syllabus and your university department takes care of all that for you and gives you the kind of cognitive bandwidth then to explore the more interesting kind of detailed questions. So on both those counts, I think the disciplines have done a decent job. Just one more thing on the Jacobs support of the disciplines. There was recently some interesting research which has a kind of one of these maps, infographics now, showing which disciplines are more interdisciplinary than others. And you're probably not surprised to hear that economics is kind of way out there. They don't refer to anybody. They're just doing their thing. And of course, they're always right all the time. You know that about economics. Other disciplines, psychology, seem to be rather interdisciplinary. Forgive me, I should have checked before tonight. It'd be nice to know where engineering is in that map. It's probably somewhere fairly central, I would think. So, I don't think the disciplines are dead. They've had a purpose. They do still have a purpose. They're both generous in their research, looking around, and they're good for learning. But but I do think these times are new times. I can't do better than many TED Talks who will wave their hands at you and saying the world is really, really changing, guys. The internet changes things. Technology is changing things. And there's a phrase which I made up, which I thought that I must have nicked from someone else, but then I Googled it and I found I am the only person to use it. So now it's a phrase I use. It's on my TEDx talk if you want to see it. We are living in an era of the explosion of the combinatorial space of ideas. You're in it right now. In those electromagnetic waves are all the ideas on the web, and you can pluck anything from anywhere and juxtapose it, contrast it, synthesize it, and that has to have some impact on the way we think about learning and research. If you like, think of that as bottom-up learning, how we learn, how we interact with the world of knowledge, and then what tools, what concepts we use and bring to bear on our research. If it doesn't, it seems to me education is either just ignoring this incredible knowledge revolution, or perhaps worse, capitulating, giving in, saying, I can't cope, it's too complicated, let's just stick with what we did in 1850, you know. And that to me just seems a disaster and defeatist and the wrong thing to do. So the structures are under pressure because where is the boundary on the internet between sociology, psychology, history and all the rest of it? But we don't quite know yet how to structure that. So I'm not anti-disciplinary. I don't go along with someone like Alan Liu, who's a scholar of English, who says that interdisciplinarity is an important rhetoric which requires us at all times to reconfigure closures to make them answer to current urgencies. I don't think we can constantly be in a state of flux where we're always reconfiguring things. And even, I don't know, well, so Joe Ito, the head of MIT lab, is also an anti-disciplinarian. He doesn't believe in the disciplines. And his image is that saying, let me get this right, it's a bit complex. Saying that, so hold on, he quotes the physicist Stanislav Ulam saying that talking about non-linear physics is like talking about non-elephant animals. In other words, everything in physics is really non-linear physics. And Ito quotes that in the context of learning and interdisciplinarity, in the sense that non-disciplinary learning is really everything. It's the stuff which isn't a non-elephant animal. And the picture he has of that is a map which is essentially white, and on that map are little spots which correspond to the disciplines, and the fun stuff is everything between those spots. That's where all the action is, and yet because of our structures, because of our research obligations, because of the way we've been brought up, we hone in more and more and more on these spots, and we lose all that wonderful whiteness where you can create and make your own kinds of things. So I kind of agree with Ito's image of that, only I wouldn't want to be so strong as to say I'm anti-disciplinary in thinking about it. So my final message is that we certainly must rethink our categories. We need to think what are the fundamental skills and methods that students need, whether they're studying engineering or English literature or biology or whatever. That makes it very exciting for educators. Those skills do not have to be necessarily disciplinary based, but they are rigorous, they should be thought through. And finally, I would have a plea for something like philosophy. It's interesting that Alan Wilson, who I mentioned earlier, this great mathematical geographer, this philosophy as one of his enabling disciplines. And by that simply means that philosophy means thinking about things. Actually, Bertrand Russell also made this point many years ago, that when things change, we need some philosophy, because you need to take perspective on things. What type of philosophy, I'm not sure, probably not the typical academic philosophy, but philosophy in the broader sense means thinking about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And I think there's a case to be made that in many courses, almost certainly engineering, sort of liberal arts and sciences course I run, some kind of framing by the educational leaders, some kind of philosophical approach to the disciplines and how they'll be put together by the students is very important. So exciting times, but to ignore the manifest changes, which I can't only wave my hands about. Actually, I can give you 50 references that prove to you that things are really, really changing.
We don't have enough time for that.
Everything from Hartmut-Roster and the accelerator social change right to all bibliographic methods, etc., etc. But so I know some people in this room still won't believe that. They'll still be skeptical about the internet changing things. I don't get that. The internet is changing things, and that kind of pressure means we must rethink some of our structures in which the disciplines sit. Probably gone on a little bit too long, but I did say 10 minutes. So.
Almost exactly 10
Okay.
minutes, maybe 11.
Okay.
Sarah.
Well, good evening, everyone. I think to get some idea of where I sit on this, are the disciplines dead, it's important perhaps to understand where I've come from and some of the things I've done. Although I'm very much seen as a traditional engineer these days, I was actually originally trained as a mathematician, so I never studied engineering at all myself. I went to work in the Unified Engineering Department at Leicester, so that's and became head of that department, which is a department that still exists. It has a very general engineering philosophy where the core things across mechanical, electrical, engineering are learnt by all, and then students specialise. I left there and I went to become head of a very unusual school, a school of engineering and digital arts at the University of Kent. Very different, creating very creative and highly employable graduates. I now find myself here at UCL in CEE, and I'm very proud to be in CEE. It was the first CEE department in England. I'm a successor to Sir John Ambrose Fleming, and we're very much about fundamental science. I'm very honoured to be president of the EPC, so I see what's going on across the engineering spectrum within the UK. For example, my daughter has just started as an undergraduate at Bristol University, where she's studying engineering design. That's a very specific course that was set up by the Royal Academy of Engineering to meet the needs of industry. So I don't see there is a norm. So I have a problem with the questioner's set, that we are somehow constrained in these disciplinary boundaries. I look across my career and I see enormous variety in the engineers I alone have been training. So my thesis is the disciplines certainly aren't dead, and we fundamentally need the laws of physics, and some people need to know these things. I've been working on the Thames Barrier this week, trying to make sure that the infrastructure London has to 2070 will stop London flooding. You want someone in there that knows about the laws of physics and is quite creative and thoughtful in terms of that particular problem. I think absolutely what we don't want to do, and I'm probably going to be at odds with colleagues here, is define a structure that says this is how we educate engineers and this is what we do. To me, that's not what we need at all. Richness and success for me is in the diversity of the provision. Engineering in the UK contributed 486 billion GDP in 2015. That's a lot. We're training 265,000 skilled entrants a year to meet the demand to 2024. We don't want a straitjacket that says this is any kind of boundary and everyone has to fit in here or do this or have learnt that. I think my career has shown me this. I think to add to the scale of the economics and the personnel requirements, we've already talked about the scale of the problem. I'm convinced engineers are going to take over the world. The scale of the problems we're considering these days are highly different. But look, we're in a domain of cyber-physical and human systems, so we're dealing not just with plant of all scales, we're dealing with humans in the loop, things are disparate geographically, different timescales. We're looking towards next generation chips that are going to be controlling and programming matter. To me, diversity is the key. And I think the UK has a rich diversity in its engineering education, and I think we want to continue to exploit and explore that. We need the disciplines as part of the piece. We need the diversity too. And I think it's a mistake to try and define an engineering education.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Michael, I invite you to now take your turn.
Well, I'm not an engineer, and when I read the title of Disciplines Dead, I did remember Mark Twain's famous statement, or supposed statement, when he read his obituary, which said the reports of his death were greatly exaggerated. And I'm therefore going to take the case that not just that it's exaggerated, but that in fact actually disciplines are critical and crucial, not only to engineering, but in a sense much more broadly to societies and to higher education. I'm a former chemistry teacher, but my university career has strangely been as a sociologist of education. And it struck me that I had some very general conclusions about disciplines, because that's really, as a sociologist, I was interested in what are these things called disciplines. So in a sense, I'm going to be a little bit more distant from the reality of engineering than my colleagues around here, but I hope that you won't find that too objectionable. So I had a number of things that struck me. One was that, in fact, there are only a small number of things that we can actually say in general about disciplines, because they are incredibly diverse. And secondly, and I think this is something that people are aware of but often forget, that in fact disciplines are organised bodies of knowledge, but they're also communities of inquirers. And that's very important. They're communities as well as bodies of knowledge. And that means that in fact they have histories, they're never static, they grow, some decline, new ones are constantly being established. So it's a much more dynamic context than, in a sense, the kind of negative view about disciplines is often thought to be. The third thing I wanted to mention was that, in fact, disciplines are the product of human specialization of thinking. That, in a sense, there was a time when there was very little specialist thinking. And gradually, since the beginning of the 19th century, that has developed in all fields, and engineering is only one of them. And, but the specialist disciplines have always had, and I think they do still have, two faces. And my former colleague, head of department, Basil Bernstein, used to talk about the faces as being the sacred and the profane. He was not talking then about disciplines, but you can make a very similar comment in relation to professions. Because on the one hand, disciplines represent, arguably, and we may not all agree, the sort of the pinnacle of humanity's search for the truth. On the other hand, they represent sources of exclusion, resistance to change, fragmentation, elitism, division, and so forth. And so, in a sense, you've always got that tension that, in a sense, about any discipline. The question about disciplines has also been asked about professions. And some of you have come across the book by the Suskins, who are, in fact, lawyers, not sociologists or engineers, called The Future Professions, of which they think there is none. And I think they're wrong for a similar reason to why I think, in a sense, the idea of the disciplines dying or being dead is wrong also. Their assumptions is that there is the main source of logical reasoning that people turn to for professions is actually accomplishable increasingly by machines. And therefore, in a sense, the professions who will resource that knowledge are in fact going to be redundant. Now, why do I think they're wrong? I think they're wrong because what I think they do is to equate logic which can be represented electronically, at least to some extent, with judgment, which is a distinctively human faculty, one of which is, of course, to make decisions about whether you're going to have design machines. In other words, to quote another 19th century philosopher who thought rather far ahead, we will always potentially be architects and not bees. Now, there are two kinds of disciplines, the humanities and the sciences. And although I shall speak only about the sciences because in a sense we're in an engineering centre here, but in fact they had similar roots because in a sense if you look back historically, they emerged out of the first discipline, the first profession, in the West anyway, which was theology. And it's also worth remembering, I think, that the first disciplines in the sense that we know them, university-based research, involved in university-based research and teaching, were in fact the humanities, established in Germany by Wilhelm Humboldt. And then the model of the humanities-based, research-based humanities was expanded into sciences throughout the 19th century. So let me repose tonight's question. Have the purposes of disciplines, and therefore their place at the heart of the university, become impediments to progress and the goal of producing new knowledge? The person I won't have time to discuss, who argued yes most strongly, some of you will be familiar with, is Michael Gibbons and his colleague in their influential book, The New Modes of Production. And they predicted a steady decline of disciplinary inquiry, but that in a sense is for another day or another evening. And what I think is worth mentioning is some of the values that are associated with disciplines, and whether they are also, in a sense, becoming less significant or redundant. Because they're very much associated with ideas like knowledge for its own sake and academic freedom. And you can trace the roots of those ideas, again, back to the first discipline, theology. And if you think for a moment about our old friend Isaac Newton, who, well, for many people, was the founder of physics, then his physics was actually part of his theology, because in a sense his purpose of doing physics was in fact to find out more about God, and he spent most of his last years, as some of you will know, actually trying to disprove the Trinity, to disprove the idea that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, and he used a lot of things people know much less about to do with alchemy to actually draw on these things. And I think that's pertinent. So for that in a sense, that's very much the roots of those ideas. Now what I want to suggest is that in fact they are not the only rationale for the values that we associate with disciplines. So when I argue, as I would do, that in fact in our increasingly secular world, disciplinary inquiries will be always with us, then I've got two kinds of answers, positive answers to that. What I call for the moment the empirical or the instrumental, and indeed the conceptual. The empirical one in a sense is obvious. But what I thought was quite interesting, some people have come across it, there's a book by David Wootton called The Discovery of Science. And what he documents very powerfully is that there really wasn't any new knowledge discovered until Columbus discovered America. That was, suddenly people realized that there could be new knowledge. If you go back before that, you found that was not so. And I thought that was quite an interesting, and in a sense, as the first example. And obviously, in a sense, discovery has moved on since then into the disciplines of every kind, which I don't need to mention. Now, my conceptual answer, which is, I hope clear, but a bit trickier, is that in fact the criteria for disciplinary inquiries that have led to new knowledge, on which the basis of all of our understanding of the world are about, are always internal to the purposes of the inquiry. And that, in a sense, that is the crucial distinction between disciplinary and non-disciplinary inquiries. But this doesn't mean that, in fact, disciplinary specialists don't have other purposes, such as prestige, their own wealth, or that the funding of them may not, in fact, hope that discoveries will lead to quite other problems. It means that the criteria for disciplinary truth are internal to the priorities of the inquiries themselves and not to any external purposes. For instance, the physicists spent 30 years trying to find evidence to support the arguments that, in fact, Higgs came up about the boson. And in the end, they found it through the Large Hadron Collider. And that, in a sense, is a good example. I'm just going to jump a bit because I know that time is wrong.
Making it easier for me then.
What?
I said, you're making it easier for me then to cut.
Yeah, yes, I could stop.
Yeah.
Let me just see what I can do. Maybe I'll just go towards the end and then we'll eat.
Some key
Now,
points.
I think that's a good idea. So what I would argue is that the claim that disciplines are dead, actually the danger of that argument or that case is that in fact it gives practice or instrumental goals a priority over the search for truth, and to forget, leads us to forget the extent to which the former depend upon the latter. And this is not saying, in a sense, that disciplines are some kind of absolute, because that, in a sense, that means, in a sense, that they've taken over the claims of theology, which, of course, they haven't, because they've actually separated themselves from theology. So they're always a priority rather than, in a sense, an absolute. And my prediction would be that if we have a world where disciplines are dead, we'd be cut off from all sources of innovation, what that are most distinctive to human understanding, and then we'd actually, in the end, have to invent them. The best example, I think, to think about what happens is, in fact, the way in which science was instrumentalized by Stalin in the Soviet era, when, in fact, there was no progress, no new knowledge, and in the end, the actual system collapsed. So to conclude, and then I'll finish. So, I think that the assertion that disciplines are dead is misconceived because it implies an over-dichotomous and static distinction between disciplines and other forms of inquiry. This is partly on account of the origins of disciplines in theology, because disciplines would always emphasize truth and their own questions rather than efficacy. But this doesn't, in a sense, mean that as a priority, it doesn't continue to be important. The secularization of disciplines and their claims to truth doesn't involve some absolute notion of truth, because they will always be vulnerable, in a sense, to other values. But only if, and this I think is a point I want to end with, only if you can envisage a society that is no longer interested in new knowledge will the search for truth, its independence from other purposes, and therefore disciplines, in fact, no longer be important. Unless we have forms of social organization, like disciplines, that allow the next generation to actually imagine alternative futures, whether it's material, biological, or even social, I'm not sure we'll have a future.
Okay. And
Sorry, I didn't get through it.
that's all right.
Okay, hi all. So I'm a chemical engineer, but I've also got a background in psychology of education, in fact from the Institute of Education here, so in a distorted way, I'm also alumnus of UCL in some way. So I'm not going to quite show my hand, but I'll say this. I mean, as someone with a background in psychology, I've introduced courses such as psychology for the engineer, which have been very popular with students, etc., etc. So that sort of gives you a clue. But as someone who now manages chemical engineering programs, I train chemical engineers to go do jobs in chemical plants that chemical engineers do. They work in design consultancies that require chemical engineering skills to build chemical engineering equipment. Now, there are lots of other jobs, as Carl mentioned, which don't require those specific discipline skills. So there is a balance here. But I'm going to start by going back a bit. I'm going to go back to the 1800s and remind people that the first professional engineering body was the Institute of Civil Engineers. And the word civil, of course, means related to the people and their concerns, as opposed to military stuff, right? So in this sense, we are all civil engineers, irrespective of our chemical mechanical, structural, electrical, or biological context. We are all doing civil engineering. Robinson Palmer was one of the founding members of the Institute of Chemical Engineers. He says, an engineer is a mediator between the philosopher and the working mechanic, and like an interpreter between two foreigners, must understand the language of both. The philosopher searches into nature and discovers her laws and promulgates the principles and adapts them to our circumstances. The working mechanic, governed by the superintendence of the engineer, brings his ideas into reality. So with a loose interpretation of the word mechanic, actually we can all relate that definition to our disciplines. We're all doing pretty much the same thing. Now, in a related manner, in engineering education circles for a number of years now, people have been commenting about the Renaissance engineer. This phrase has been pushed around a bit. So what is the Renaissance engineer? Entrepreneurial engineers with a social conscience, a sense of global citizenship. And there's in fact one school in Toronto, the Lausanne School of Toronto, as part of the York University there, that on their websites they say home of the Renaissance engineer. And according to their websites, well, they define this as Renaissance engineers being thinking in big systems, not little silos, designed with people in mind and embrace ambiguity. So this is all very well. You know, we have to train our students, irrespective of the specific discipline, to be aware of financial processes, environmental laws, ethical awareness, an entrepreneurial approach, an awareness of impacts of their work. So in a way, an awareness that engineering is just one big social experiment. But similarly, and more optimistically, I guess, the role of engineers as aspirational people, using aspirational approaches towards practical engineering outcomes based on ethical decision making and leadership. So, okay, it's hard to argue against such romantic and altruistic sentiments. This is all good for the world. And inevitably, curricula which is broad in its science and broad in its liberal education and non-technical education will help create such useful and such aspirational people, perhaps, or give them at least a greater scope to apply the skills that they need to apply. But let's step out of this romantic Jane Austen type world for a minute, I think. As mentioned by Carl, he expressed it a lot more eloquently than I can. There's been an explosion of scientific development and understanding since the 1800s. And current employer needs are such that graduates, engineering graduates, have to hit the ground running, both in technical competence and personal effectiveness. And it's just not possible, I think, to train people, train students within the 3 to 4 year time frame to be able to step into a broad spectrum of engineering roles and yet satisfy employer needs for specific discipline expertise. And that's the issue here. A chemical engineer is a very different animal to an electrical engineer, separated perhaps by at least 2 years of indoctrination. Yeah, and at a time where they're most cognitively receptive to such indoctrination as well. So, you know, how do you reverse those effects? There's colleges like Olin College, I mentioned Lausanne, who are seen to be revolutionary in their approach of this general integrated type engineering. I'd argue that some of these schools, like Olin, are based on elitism. They're for highly gifted students within exceptionally funded institutions.
Just like UCL.
Perhaps. So, moreover, in the UK, school specialisation in the form of A-levels forces some engineering discipline separation already. You really ought to know something about chemistry if you want to be a chemical engineer. So already we've sort of done that separation. So if we accept the premise of the Renaissance engineer and the notion of a general engineer contributing to civil matters, as civil engineers that we all are, how do we then consolidate the immediate employer and industry needs? Well, we need to loosen the boundaries. We need to allow students to occasionally foray into the other side, into the other disciplines. So at least they're more receptive to broader systems thinking and even later professional diversification. So UCL's integrated engineering program is an example of this, perhaps, and maybe some of the general engineering programs with latter year specialization, and in my own institution, our efforts of having a multidisciplinary design project amongst the M-level students are other approaches. But I don't think any of these go far enough. I think firstly we need to have some form of integrated science at A-level or at school level, so as to allow entry into programs that allow uniform education across the engineering disciplines. And that's including biological and chemical. So when people talk about engineering foundation and integrating engineers and things like that, they seem to forget about chemical engineers. Oh, but they need a chemistry A level. So somewhere there's mixed messages here. We then need project and problem-based curricula with a design premise throughout that allows knowledge and skills development across the industry sectors, whether that be for a whole plant, a process, a product, with full socioeconomic considerations as well. And finally, we need complementary postgraduate specialization that prepares students for specific discipline expertise. So, this is no different to training of medical doctors, general practitioners. This is a synonym for general engineers, yeah? They graduate as general practitioners, then they have postgraduate qualifications to specialize. This is no different to psychologists who get a general psychology degree and then need to specialize in clinical, health, organizational counseling, psychology, whatever it is. So if this kind of training undertaken by people who tinker around with the mind and the body works, it should work and it should be relevant for people who tinker around with the world, engineers. So the disciplines are not dead, nor should they die, but the separate evolutions of the disciplines, these different civil engineerings, if you like, has compromised the integrity of the common foundations and undermined the training of engineers towards truly pliable, creative, and systemic roles. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. That's quite a diverse group and very different perspectives, so thank you all for that. I think the only thing that I would add, and I'm going to leave it and bring some questions in from the group, is here at UCL in the IEP program that we've been leading and now in our 4th year, UCL has always had identities in the programs. So the departments, the students feel at home in the departments, and that's the way our structure is. And I think even in the professions, there's a sense of identity with the disciplines. And that's not something that we can just simply throw away. I think, likening to what Michael had said about these communities, there are communities established and we want to invite new graduates into them. So that fundamental connection to identity is something that the IEP is highly aware of and we're working with, and perhaps something to consider, particularly for our graduates and their future. So I'm happy to open up to the floor. I do have a question already from Peter. Do feel free.
Well, first, an apology. I shouldn't have had one. It's been a very slow summer. So I read Scale by Geoffrey West. I don't know how many people have picked up that yet. And I also went to a lecture on Shakespeare, which is not something I do every week. Strangely, I got a similar message, which reinforces one of Carl's initial comments. And there's a very depressing line in Scale where West posits the effect of big data, which is the internet, the effect of big data on science, could be to remove the need for any theory of science. You just collect enough data to say, that's what happened.
Don't believe that.
Don't need a theory, that is what happened. I find it interesting.
I don't believe it.
I just put it forward as something else, but it was reinforced in the lecture on Shakespeare, where this guy whose name I've sadly forgotten or I would drop it, said, never mind what it means, does it work? He was speaking about not over-analysing Shakespeare's words, but saying, you see it on stage, ask yourself simply, does it work? Not what does it mean? So I think those are quite interesting comments about the way things are changing. if I could just be a little bit more parochial about engineering now, it seems to me that something that you've either deliberately or colluded in our meeting, but we're in an engineering department. It seems to me that engineering, the word, describes a sort of process, and when we're dealing with engineering education, we're trying to encourage people to think in a certain style we think has some value to society. What they're thinking about and the disciplines or the sub-disciplines, as I tend to call them, at which they display their expertise, traditionally we might say, as a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering, we recognise 35 engineering bodies. Well, that number's too small. But the areas in which people might be expert and might need, in a sense, to service an industry and get to know something, there's many more than 35 of those, lots and lots of them. So for me, the education process is about engineering, an approach, a way of thinking, and then learning about something. And there are many more than 35 of those somethings you might learn about. So to that extent, I don't want the disciplinary boundaries. There's many more things you can learn about than chemical engineering, electronic engineering, civil engineering, materials engineering in my case. So I just offer that.
And the word engineer in its best form is a verb. It's to do.
It's also
Do you find, though, those 35s just get bigger? That we just take these new type of engineers and say, well, they're just mechanical engineers, or they're, you know, something of a electrical
That's
engineer.
why I'm rather against disciplines as defined by professional bodies, because the professional bodies exist to give comfortable lives to their employees and to recruit more fee-paying people. It has nothing to do with the advancement of society or education. They're there, they're self-fulfilling to get their company car, as far as I can see. and therefore, their drivers are all wrong. All wrong.
That's a really interesting critique of Michael's position on the professions, actually. I mean, I'm sympathetic a bit to both. Do you think, well, listen to what an engineer says about professions. It's interesting, isn't it? Are they just sort of cartels, really, and a bit old school in feathering the nest of the people there, or are they necessary for advancing?
It makes it difficult to fill that white space.
Yes, it does.
When things need to fall into the silo of mechanical or civil or electrical.
Acceptance. I mean, I was just interested in your comment about your integrated engineering course, because I don't know about its substantive content. The question would be, in a sense, if you're actually giving them a chance to become, if you like, neophyte engineers by joining a community, what is that community and what does it relate to the wider community of engineers? Oh, I'm an integrated engineer, what does that mean? And I mean, it seems to me that that's going to, I mean, that's going to be always a question if you haven't had some kind of discipline foundation before you tackle your integrated engineering.
Or you're going to find students like myself, where I did my bachelor program in mechanical and then ended up doing research in civil because I used my, you know, technical background of aerospace engineering in the mechanical sense, and you know, provided it and did it on the built environment, right? So what I was learning, the theory of it, was applied in very different disciplines. So I no longer relate myself as a mechanical engineer or a civil engineer, but I have, you know, the background and the experience of both. Yeah, so, and I can no longer say that I have specialisms in those areas, but I am very proficient, I guess, of the work that they do.
Yeah, I was going to say, sorry, I should declare my name. I'm Vice President of the Institution of Civil Engineers, actually. and I run an engineering design practice, so I'm a practitioner, I'm not an academic. I think actually it's very easy to look at professional institutions and draw that conclusion, but most active, certainly volunteers within them, don't feel like that. We don't give up our Saturdays to buy anyone at BMW, but yeah, that's right. What I was going to say is an observation really on the history of professional institutions, which in my opinion mirrors the evolution of guild bodies, and essentially was linked very much to the sort of activity, a work activity, employment activity. So you were a carpenter, you joined the Carpenters Guild, you made carpentry stuff. And if you look at the origins of the institutions, they really mapped to work that people were doing. So the Institution of Civil Engineers grows out of a bunch of people being asked to make dams, canals and all the rest of it. and trying to get together to figure out how to do it without killing people or falling over and making a fool of yourself. And the spin-off institutions, if you look at the history of the way those happened, was actually, we're not really doing dams and canals anymore, we're making steamboats or planes, or whatever. And so the proliferation of the institutions followed very much the development of the economy and the way that productive activity happened in the economy. And I think that one of the difficulties is at some point that accelerated, that subdivision of what are people doing, accelerated and kind of left these institutions and the disciplines that, you know, leave behind somehow. So we find ourselves now, and I'm speaking from the construction industry and civil engineering is quite interesting. So we train to do engineering in engineering departments, or lots of us do. And then we go and work in the construction industry. The construction industry doesn't look like manufacturing business on the whole. We work with architects and planners, and we work in the environment. So this disconnect between the environment we train in, associated with some ancient conception of our job, we now find our jobs don't map to that very well. I don't know how true that is in other disciplines, but I think that's essentially what we find at the moment, is that we're working in a place that doesn't feel very like the place we're educating in. The sort of questions we're being asked aren't the same questions. So I studied maths, physics and all that sort of stuff, and I sit and people talk about planning law to me.
About what?
Planning law, and the reason this job isn't happening is because we haven't got the consultation on. Stakeholders don't agree with me, or some policy change is happening. And that seems to have nothing to do with what I studied all those years ago when I was at university. And so it's not that the disciplines are dead. In my view, it may be that we're not evolving that body, that corpus of knowledge, that exploration, and the way that we learn about this stuff quickly enough to meet the needs of life.
Or even understanding what engineering actually is in the workforce, and how a civil engineer actually works in very different environments, instead of the back room working on just technical.
That definition, the Treadgold definition of what engineering was, the art of modifying, I mean, I use my words of modifying the physical world for the use and benefit of mankind. He had a 19th century version of it. Well, it was an art. It was an art, and it wasn't defined what was in that art. The art of communicating with people could easily fit in there, solving differential equations, understanding how to put things together. Those were all within. That art evolves. How do we do that stuff evolves? I don't think the disciplines necessarily lined up with the...
I've got a few hands up here, so if you
I
could
just
quickly...
completely agree with that. It's very beautifully put. I mean, a VC approached me recently and just said, I spoke at a conference on interdisciplinarity and law, and artificial intelligence and law, and another huge hybrid area that's growing up where no one can speak to one another. And he said, you're basically right. It's a huge soup out there, and we need people who can negotiate that soup and explain it to other people. And I think we're at this level. All we can say is, wow, there's a lot of change going on. There's health people working with gamification people. There's finances working with consultants in psychology. And we're all thinking, this is really exciting. But what are the new categories and what are the new professions that map onto that?
Question over here, or comment.
Just to remind us, 10 years ago we were talking about the T-shaped engineer. The idea being that you excelled in your discipline, and it gave you the confidence, it gave you the credibility, and also gave you a set of tools, problem solving. And then now to be honest, in education we didn't necessarily fix the rest of it. We sent out in the world and they had to learn finance and law and environment, all of that outside, but it kind of happened. So with that in mind, I say, what's new? And then what really struck me was the
ESA. It's a difficult one.
To my more radical proposal that, yes, we still need to do that, we turn it on its head. We do the generalisation first, and then do the specialisation later. So I'd love to hear some of the other speakers, like that's really radical, because that turns, I mean, we've been aware of this problem, but we've specialised and then allowed them to generalise. And to be fair, I think, particularly in the postgraduate space, even in education, like modern research is multidisciplinary and they're really interesting stuff. But what other people think about turning it on its head? We do the general first and specialise later.
Well, and so the other thing I would add to that pot is, does every student or anyone that's going to become an engineer have to be both?
Generalised.
Do they have to have a specialism and be able to cope with the generalizations? Or can we you know, we need students that want to be at the guru, you know, in the technical field, that want to put their head down and advance the technology or advance the discipline.
So
But then we want others that want to be able to make the links.
The analogy is the same. Do you want to be a general practitioner or do you want to be a surgeon? It's
I
the
think
same
that,
thing.
I think that's, I
In
think
some
that there's a
contexts, they
validity
won't
there.
require that.
Yeah,
And when
Is
I
the
think
one
of
question, what does the economy need?
good question. Yeah,
That's it.
certainly.
Even surgeons now need to be able to work with robots, and with it's all changing.
So I am also going to ask you if you want to say your question, because you've had your
I'll
hand
be
up.
quick with the question and a little bit at the end. My question is, and you're the only person,
Asat.
You're the only person we went, actually, wait a minute, we're all actually asking the wrong things here. I've been to another conference at Imperial with Carl Wyman and talking about the changing the educational strategy there. He completely missed the point. The point was that you're talking about universities, and there's a whole load of stuff that happens before that. And
That's the problem.
What needs to change for children who now become university graduates to tackle the suit? What needs to change? Or is it that actually disciplinary knowledge is more valuable the younger you are, so you're able to do the interdisciplinary stuff? So I'll leave that as a question, and then I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Any thoughts on that?
I've definitely got some thoughts about that. Yeah. I think we need more research on this. I've got kids who are about 13 and 10 now, and I've given a talk where my conjecture is actually that breadth is very good when you're little. It seems crazy to stop kids playing till they're about the age of 7, 8 or 9. There may be some value in disciplinary structures at adolescence, because the adolescent brain is this amazing continent we're just beginning to understand, but it's certainly a complex, turmoil-ridden continent, and possibly the disciplinary structures are good there, and possibly then widening out again at undergraduate level in the sort of world that I work in. That I think would be nice to know a bit more about that. But what I would say, and I'm passionate about, is the bonkers narrowness of British 16 to 18 education. We are the narrowest education system in the world, I believe. I think Mauritius may be the only other place. Everywhere you go, even our ex-colonies, which we're so proud of poo-pooing how kind of backward they are, whether it's China, well, China wasn't quite a bigger part, but India and so on, they have 4 or 5 A levels as a basic, and it's just mad, and we're going backwards now to no AS levels and 3, and all the public schools are saying, no, you better just do humanities or just do sciences, otherwise you won't get in these elite institutions, and it's a tragedy. So certainly I would say breadth 16 to 18, but I would be cautious about getting rid of the disciplines in that crucial kind of adolescent period, because the kind of project-based stuff and the real conceptual complexity that just saying to kids, you know, here's the project, go and do it, throws out, I think that can be really hard for them to cognitively work with. That's my position.
You know, we're doing a really bad job at selling engineering to school kids, and then we're fighting amongst ourselves in terms of which engineering discipline they should go into as well. And the social pressures and the social influences can't be underestimated here. There's a family friend, brilliant chap, he's doing his A-levels, second year of A-levels now, straight A stars, goes to Latimer School, North London. He wants to do mechanical engineering. When you probe in a little bit with him, he doesn't really know what mechanical engineering is or what other engineering might offer him, but he's been forced to select a route on the basis of what he might like to do as a career and what he might want to tinker around with. And we're letting those kids down. We're perhaps limiting them in achieving their full potential in life to some, that's strong, I know, but to some extent, maybe.
There was, I see John's hand, but there was the lady behind John, yes.
Yeah, just a quick comment. My disciplining interface is between science and business and entrepreneurship for researchers, and that's been mostly pretty discipline agnostic over the years, into many thousands. And the discipline, just to Carl's point, that has produced the best entrepreneurs consistently over the years is in fact philosophy. Philosophers make amazing entrepreneurs. But the question I wanted to ask the panel actually was actually after Sarah's point, is the nature, the constraint that disciplines provide. And he was saying that it's not such a constraint in your world of research. But it is, I'm just asking the panel maybe that the constraint is much higher in teaching, because it's been really, really hard to actually in my experience, to introduce really well-integrated business and science, technology and entrepreneurship teaching within most universities, especially elite universities. It's harder the more elite the university is.
I'm very excited by all this, but I've spoken a lot, so if anyone else would like to offer something on that, otherwise I'll help you out. So I think one of my things is generalism, actually, as a phrase that's really gone out of fashion. And it touches some things that Michael was saying, sort of about the history and sociology of knowledge. You know, there was a period where to be a good scholar, to quote Isaac Barrow, Newton's predecessor at Cambridge, you had to be a general scholar, because as Barrow said, one part of learning doth confer light upon the other. And I wouldn't bet against there being another great period of polymathy and general attributes being required. It's very hard to conceive when you're in it, because we all want to be those specialists who really get, you know, what the Higgs boson is or what Shakespeare's works really tell us. That seems like what we value in knowledge, that very narrow expertise. We admire those people. But why is it necessarily the case that historically we couldn't return to a period where we value more generalism and polymathy? And there are things I can say about, can I just finish my point and you can come back on that? And I would say that with regard to what you're saying about, that's the more generalist, polymathic teacher increasingly has a role if they're at a high enough level. If they can facilitate the learning of a broad range of students, whether it's in engineering and the sort of interesting things you're doing, by being that, I know it's a bit of a cliche, but more the guide at the side rather than the content deliverer, by saying, oh, what are you doing? That's interesting. Tell me about that. How are you putting that together? Not expecting every teacher to know in great detail exactly everything they're teaching, because it's really all on the web up to postgraduate level anyway. By that kind of high-level generalist approach, deeply intelligent people, schooled in a wide range of things, but able to facilitate that type of program, I see a role for those people, and not just in teaching, I see them everywhere. Throughout every white-collar sector, that sort of person is more and more in demand. So I'm positive and I'm excited about that, but it's still, historically in sociology, quite a difficult thing to grasp how that might come about.
Michael, did you have a short comment on that?
Yeah, I find it very interesting you raised that. I mean, about generalism, because I think it's, I certainly think it's worth distinguishing between two meanings of the term, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you look at policy, and if you look at, for instance, the OECD and PISA and all these things, they are all pressing for generic skills of a particular kind, thinking skills, being able to do certain kinds of operations. Now that's one kind of generalism,
Mm-hmm.
but I think that is actually rather dangerous, actually, because in a sense, you never get a chance to actually apply what's general to the particular, and in a sense, there is no progress in your knowledge. You can't go from one form of generic skill to another, or to have one kind of generic skill, say a thinking skill. You can't develop a better thinking skill. There are no criteria for that. But there is, but in a sense, the other kind of generalism, and that's what perhaps was more what you were talking about earlier, was in fact a generalism that actually related to the contents, to the particular, so that in a sense people had concepts that were general, that they could apply to the particular, and then in fact progress. So I think one has to ask, how for a learner, how do they progress in their knowledge? And I don't think they progress in their knowledge for getting more thinking skills. I think they progress in their knowledge for thinking more about particular things.
Or the application of
Yeah,
those things.
so actually the content part
Is
is
important.
very, very important if you're going to do that.
Yeah,
I don't know whether that
think
makes
so
sense to
too.
you, but
I think I'm going to
Yes
ask
and
this.
no.
I'm going to ask you to ask your question. Yes.
Yeah, so I was really interested in your image of these empty spaces and the coloured
It's
dots.
the guy from MIT's image, really, Joe Ito.
Yeah, okay, but that's the one that you brought today. But I was just reflecting on, and I agree with some of the comments from the panel, that the value of disciplines is to provide rigour and depth. And by the way, I'm a bit of a mole because I'm a chemist, and although I work in a School of Engineering and Material Sciences at Queen Mary. And I think actually, if we think of disciplines and degrees, because they're not exactly the same thing, and actually as a chemist I can tell you that in the last couple of decades there's been around chemistry a few degrees, and I'm not going to name names, that actually are less disciplinary, and actually people living in the real world with problems have come back and actually said, we don't want this, we want a chemist or a physicist, and we want the depth and the rigor of the disciplines, and then we can actually go into these problems a bit like you were talking about the T. So where do we, how do we actually connect that disciplinary rigor and depth in training and education, and then go into the incentive spaces? So you said that the disciplines are under pressure, and there were a bit of psychological analogies today, so I would maybe suggest that they are, disciplines might be depressed or anxious. And so, but in the same way that actually a proposal in psychology is to have awareness of our own thought processes to be able to transcend them, isn't that, if we provide the depth of the discipline and then an awareness of that, what does it mean to be an engineer? What does it mean to be a chemist? What does it mean be able to then use that awareness of what I have become in order to transcend and populate together those empty spaces? And I think that in STEM subjects in particular, we do that particularly badly. Although engineers are much better at training and a self-awareness of what it means to be an engineer than the sciences, for example. But isn't that the way forward, to do a bit of like discipline therapy?
Always like a bit of therapy.
Yeah, I mean, quite possibly. I think that is a really nice, almost an analogy of what we do, what we're trying to do with the IEP, in terms of allowing the students from day one to realize that your discipline, where you will be going, you'll be working alongside other engineers and other people from other disciplines, and to be aware that these partnerships are crucial to actually get the work done or tackle the problems in the real world. I think increasing awareness from day one of the application of the discipline is really important, and I think actually some of the programs should really adapt to those that don't want to be the specialist. Yeah, there should be a route for those that want to be someone like me, that actually enjoys bringing the disciplines together to make something really useful and have an impact on people and society. Yeah, so that's what how I call myself an engineer, but I'm not technically driven, right? I'm not the one that wants to be the guru. I want to bring people together to make an engineering process come to fruition.
Yeah, I don't think we need the disciplines to get depth. I mean, there's enough commonality amongst the engineering. I mean, we all talk about heat transfer and fluids and mathematical modelling and thermodynamics. What it is context. And if we change the context, if we, projects involving energy, projects involving water supply, the real global challenges, and then that links and develops the critical thinking skills that we're always going on about. So. I don't think if in a nicely designed program, I don't know much about the UCL program, so I don't want to go in theory, I think it's a good idea. Because it is this project-based, integrating disciplines, and I think that in itself provides the depth.
You're making a brilliant case for the University of Hereford.
Well,
absolutely.
I'm just going to give. John's had his hand up for a little while, and I know he probably has something to say about that as well, our experiences. So we've been smiling to each other when
But I think we sort of potentially talk ourselves in a bit of a catch-22 here. I think we're recognising that disciplines are important at a point, and understanding that they're communities of practice and things that draw people together, they are important. But they're important as people go through their careers and develop, and people change disciplines and move between things, and the disciplines will change. Which I think is what gives us as educators a problem, in that we don't want the flux of changing disciplines, we don't want something. And so, when I wrote this title, it was as much about, is it the boxes that we put things in universities that we have trouble with? And it would be great if we could predict what those 36 or 120 or whatever they will be are going to be in 15 years' time, but prediction is difficult, especially about the future. We can't do that. Therefore, what do we know? We're pragmatic people as engineers. What do we design our curriculum to be to give the students that are coming through in some form of box, and maybe we need to start thinking about changing those to be broader and better connected, that allow those routes through, whether it's the sort that Emanuela talked about, of the specialist versus the more generalist, the more collaborative, collector, the design type of person that brings those teams together, or the person that do the specific bit, or people that want to work across very different sorts of engineering that haven't even been thought of by us at the moment. And that's, I guess, what is our challenge of how can we design something that hasn't got a vision of what the disciplines will be in 50 years, 30 years time.
Sorry.
So the missing step, so your graduates will need specialist postgraduate courses for whatever that might be. And it could be just chemical engineering, a one-year course in MSc in chemical engineering for those people to move into that specialisation. But that's a complete change in the system that we have.
But we don't know. In 5 years' time,
It might be
20 years' time, there might be more neuromorphic engineers than there are chemical engineers, or whatever AI engineers.
So it's more of a pliable model.
We don't know.
And I would turn my experience on its head. So could I be the engineer that I am now, the interdisciplinary, integrated person that brings people together, that's functioning in that white space?
Mm-hmm.
Could I be that person without my mechanical background and my civil research, right? I'm not sure. Did I need to go through that process, or can you introduce the interdisciplinary without having some depth or some understanding of a discipline itself?
Can I do the depth thing? Because I feel quite passionate about that. I think, who was it who said, I think it was ESAT said that disciplines don't equal depth. I think that's really, really true. Just to give a couple of examples from my own course. This may not apply so much to engineering, but it'll certainly overlap. But one of the examples I'm going to give is an engineer. I think the depth comes from a 3 or 5 or ND perspective of the problem, not from the discipline. And I'll start with my non-engineering example and quickly give my engineering example. So a student on my course was interested in global child mental health. So the object of her study is very clear. It's how children's mental health is diagnosed, analysed, treated all over the world. You won't find an undergraduate degree in that. You might even struggle to find some postgraduate degrees in that. But if you put together perspectives from psychology, anthropology, sociology, immunology, you get depth. She, as a recent graduate from our programme, was uniquely expert, let's use that word, in global child mental health because she hadn't done a single discipline, because she'd known what the object of study was and illuminated that from many different sides. Now my sort of punchline is we had a student who wrote a dissertation on small-scale anaerobic digestion, looking at how one might install and implement one of these low-tech boxes using food waste from a hall of residence and feeding it back in as heat. But she wasn't even an engineer on our program. She was supervised by 2 engineers from UCL engineering. She taught herself enough Mathematica, enough MATLAB to do some great modeling. But in her course with us, she'd done environmental engineering, environmental sociology, law, and environmental economics. And her dissertation was a multi-perspectival view of the feasibility of the installation of small-scale anaerobic digestion plants. Now, she won a World Undergraduate Award for that dissertation. She got into an extremely competitive, prestigious Masters at Oxford, Environmental Change Management. She was an expert precisely because she wasn't in one discipline, but she brought to bear on that highly hybrid modern problem in the circular economy perspectives from different disciplines. So I think we need both. It's just what you're saying. We need disciplinary people, we always will, but my perspective in looking at it is the system is set up for a ton of those, too many of those, and not enough of my students who can do this. The people at UCL and these institutions can do this if we give them the structures, the kind of openness you were talking about, some of the tools, they can become expert in very modern, real and meaningful ways, which is nothing to do with one particular. In fact, it's more than not to do with a discipline, it's only possible if you take multiple disciplinary perspectives.
I'm very aware of time. It's 7:15. I was told that there are drinks downstairs at 7:15. So I'm going to carry on with this because I know there are 4 hands that I've seen raised. But we have to be really quick and short, and probably no more questions, but more like comments. Okay? So we'll go here, then here, and I believe there was one there, and then we'll finally end with you. Please.
So on the subject of the generalist specialist question, we've been doing some work over the last probably 5-10 years on the pedagogy of design teaching. And we've done quite a lot of work as designers looking at the process that designers go through. And an observation in that space around this is that conceptual design, so early stage design, the polymaths win every single day of the week. That the ability to generate and jump around solution space, draw on analogies, experience, observation from different fields is utterly critical to that. And the specialists really kick in when you're trying to decide whether it's going to work or not. They've got 1,000 tests on it. And the later stages of design, and production stages of design, the specialists again are very valuable because they are quite comfortable efficiently producing the design and detail of all this sort of stuff here. So I think actually it's quite helpful to value both of these. We coined the term actually, when I was a young engineer, a generalist was somebody who wasn't clever enough to be a specialist. And so we've got lots of specialists who were very clever, but it turned out they couldn't invent anything. And so we came up with the idea of the specialist generalist, someone who actually got rather good at having an ability to integrate and generalise and draw from. And the final little observation, we've had an hour and 20 minutes now. Every single idea has been expressed in terms of the individual. That these specialists, the knowledge they carry and they individually acquire. And I've worked in engineering for nearly 30 years. I've never done anything on my own. And I think that there's something missing from this conversation about the way that the group knowledge, the shared constructs and the language that you get in groups of individuals are somewhere, maybe next time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
So I'm coming at it from an employment point of view, ex-head of learning from Rolls-Royce. I spent, one of my jobs was a pipeline of talent coming in. So my discussions with the engineering function sort of reflects this stuff from the other way. It ended up where we needed about 10% of really in-depth people who can solve technical problems and keep moving the product forward. 90% were much more like you. People who got enough of a depth to be able to work in a team, move around, and apply that knowledge to solving problems and making projects come in under cost, on time, to schedule. We got into some trouble when we had too many specialists who really developed one part of a product without understanding impacts on others. So we've actively managed that generalism, people who pick up something new. We've been moving people from aerospace into nuclear. And it's just really good, guys. And they find, oh, it is. But moving that around to people just like you. The key skill we look for is communications, working in teams, being able to communicate. My experience of a lot of graduates, and we recruited from around the world, was they're so used to working alone. The hardest thing was making them work in teams.
So you should go generalist then specialist then, is what you're saying.
I don't think I said either, actually. I think we
On
need
the other side.
some really in-depth people who will carry on being gurus in materials or whatever.
Yeah.
But many more people who can get the job.
Right, just before I come to you, I have seen a hand, yes, do speak.
Just a very short point, I'm just mainly in agreement with Carl Gombrich's point. So in context, I'm a first year student on the BASc course, I'm a bit biased. As a student of IB who rejected A-levels as too monodisciplinary and doing art foundation, year of engineering, finally coming to this course, I feel it's perfect for me because not only does the interdisciplinarity allow me the freedom to explore different departments and different specialisms, but not only that, it allows for the confidence in my own ability as an interdisciplinary scholar to find something that I really want to do. Whereas I found, not only for myself but other students, they feel constrained by their own departments in not being able to explore different different dissertation topics, different careers, different everything. In reference to a lecture given at the start of our induction week, we were asked, what do you want to do, whereas what do you want to be? At school I was always taught what do you want to be, and I think this course is useful because it teaches you what you actually want to do.
I like the
Thank
interdisciplinary
you.
scholar.
Thank you very much for that.
That was a good. I like that phrase, that interdisciplinary scholar.
We have
I
the
don't
best.
think we
We
use
have
that
the
enough.
best students on the planet, as you can see. There's no doubt about that.
Yes, please.
Phil Davis from Atkins, so I'm look after technical learning development and big design company. I think there may have been more PEIs when I started out, and I think my own institution, one of my own institutions, has absorbed several smaller ones over time. For example, I think manufacturing engineering, production engineering, radio and electronics. Point is, I think as technology has advanced, we've had to break into small groups so that people can put cognitive effort into developing those specialisms, and then sometimes there's a period of consolidation. I have a hunch that sort of systems engineering came out because there was a need to start joining it back together again, and people had kind of got too stuck in their silos and weren't looking over the walls at what was going on elsewhere. So systems engineers came in to plug it all together again. However, we live in a time when sort of networks, openness, social media and so on mean that the opportunities for cross-disciplinarity are better than they've ever been in the past, and we need to get the best out of it. So one thing we could do is to make sure that professionals look outside the silos, so they know, even if they don't have that depth of expertise in other areas, when they need to phone a friend, they need to know what that friend can do.
Yeah.
I think that's something we could make a point of sort of building in, is that so that I worked in my little side of 28 years, control systems engineering on the railway. For 6 years I've been looking after L&D in a huge company, and I never knew the difference between geotechnical and civil and mechanical. I do now, and I just wish a lot of other people did, because then they could phone a friend.
Very good. And our final
This is great. I want to make a point that brings together, I think, what our three industrial colleagues have said. And I think it's something of an answer to Carl's point that there aren't enough, that the university system doesn't produce enough generalists. So you're not saying that generalists are the only people that
No, of course not.
Which is to remind us all that the workplace is a really good place for learning. And I think that a lot of the issues we're talking about, if the workplace was much better organised for learning in the ways exactly that you say, because workplaces, it seems to me, stumble, as it were, from one thing to another, because there isn't an overarching educational, necessarily an overarching educational philosophy informing them. But if the workplace was more kind of integrated with learning, both from early life, but actually critically through professional life, which is after all much longer, and has actually lots more potential for developing into new directions. But I think I think many workplaces, perhaps including our own, just don't take advantage of those opportunities because we spend all our time at the grindstone and we're not actually thinking enough about what we're doing for all sorts of interesting and important economic reasons maybe. But I think if we could find a way to realise the potential of learning at work, a lot of the issues we're talking about would actually be resolved in some way because actually we do need to be solving problems, and the problem with traditional disciplines, of course, is that they're more concerned about defining knowledge and codifying it, and problems are often solved by uncodified knowledge as well as codified knowledge. So I don't know, I'll leave it there. I think it rounds up right quite nicely.
Well, thank you very much. The discussion went on much longer than I expected, but it was very rich, and thank you very much for our speakers for setting it all off. I invite you downstairs for some drinks. Thank you very much.